Hi, my name is Victor. People also call me Bolton, my family name. And in May 2024, I graduated with a bachelor's degree from MIT. I pursued a double major in biological engineering and computation and cognition. Still, at the end of the day, it was actually my language classes where I felt the most at home. Oh yeah, MIT has a reputation for being a STEM school. We don't have that many undergrads actually majoring in the humanities. However, I think our humanities departments are still pretty exceptional. Every MIT undergrad is required to take a bunch of classes in the humanities in order to graduate, and the popularity of the global languages classes really speaks to the quality of education and the professionalism of our instructors. I think the statistic is that somewhere around 25% of MIT undergrads take a language class at some point in their career, which is massive. Before I embarked on my journey with Spanish, in my sophomore and junior years, I first took 4 semesters of Chinese. I was really inspired by the dedication and expertise of all of my 老师 that at one point it dawned on me that I'm not going to be an MIT student forever. I won't always have access to the same language learning resources that I had while in college. And so I thought to myself that beyond the skills that I was developing in Mandarin Chinese, I also dedicated a lot of time not only to learning the language, but also to evaluating the methodologies that all my amazing 老师 were using. I reflected on which methodologies work really well for me and which ones maybe aren't the best fit with my personality, knowing that one day I will use all of these things that I've learned to try and learn a language entirely on my own. And while I initially thought that that time would be far away in the future, in summer 2023, I suddenly found myself with 3 months entirely for myself, no work, no internship. And so I thought, why not try to learn Spanish during this time? Why not evaluate myself for how well I had learned to learn languages? I created and followed through with a study plan for the summer, and after the end of it, at the beginning of the fall semester next year, I reached out to Global Languages at MIT to sign up for a language placement interview. I was hoping to get an external, objective perspective on what my language level was at the time. We can frequently be poor judges of our own abilities. And also I wanted to place into a Spanish language course so that I could identify the flaws in my language learning methodology and use those resources and those classes to mend up the holes in my study. My language interview was conducted by the wonderful Professora Mariana San Martin, who assessed that I had covered enough material in those 3 months to jump ahead to the 4th semester of Spanish. Something that came to me as a massive surprise, and it was a great honor for me, was that at the end of the year, the Global Languages Unit at MIT honored me with their student award for excellence for my study of Chinese, for my study of Spanish, and as they later noted in an article on their website, they were honoring me for achieving a mastery of the Spanish language in just 3 months. I know these are some very big, very kind words, and I am very thankful to the whole team at Global Languages at MIT. But before I continue with the rest of this video, I feel like it's necessary to explain exactly what they meant with their comments, the way that I understand it, especially because words like fluency in a language or mastery of a language kind of have different definitions that different people use. I think, again, based on what I understand, by achieving mastery in 3 months, they specifically attested that my usage of the grammar of the language was like that of an advanced user, and that I had a breadth of vocabulary that was similar to that of an advanced user. It's important to note that what I had achieved is something very different from spoken proficiency, from the ability to speak with ease, because as it became obvious from the interview, I was still not yet at the stage where I could hold conversations with native speakers without creating a burden on them to understand me. I still knew how to express myself quite well, but something that I hadn't really drilled was coming up with phrases to express myself quickly on the spot. If we use the Common European Framework, which if you're not familiar with, I will put a link in the description. Based on the Common European Framework, my written and spoken understanding of the language was probably around a low C1 level. I was already at the advanced stages. My writing was probably at the B2 level. However, my speaking abilities were somewhere between B1 and B2, where most commonly B2, the upper intermediate level, is what is considered as the benchmark for basic fluency in the language. If you reach B2 in spoken fluency, then you can claim that you are fluent in the language. So that's just the overall assessment of my Spanish after 3 months and what learning Spanish in 3 months meant for me personally. My methodology was much better suited for getting a more academic understanding of the language. And I want to emphasize this again. This is my assessment of the situation. This isn't a breakdown that Global Languages has given me of my ability. But what I presented to you guys is just my best estimate. So considering all of this, I think it's time to jump into what exactly I did to learn Spanish in this time span. I'm going to get to specific techniques in the later part of the video, but first, I think it's really important to consider a big picture view of what it takes to learn a language really well.
Nadia.
Our first consideration that we need to take into account, which I think is also a major source of confusion for language learners is time and what exactly time represents. Because more frequently, when we discuss our language learning journeys colloquially, what we refer to when we speak about time is the time span. How long it took from when we started to learn the language to where we are now. So, for example, we might hear somebody say, "Oh, I've been learning Spanish for 2 years," or "Oh, I've been learning this language for several months," which is much easier to estimate, but it doesn't give you a good idea of where that person should be with their language. For 2 years, you could have been studying for 15 minutes a week or several hours a week, and those two different paces are going to result in wildly differing outcomes. As such, a much better measure of the time we've spent on a language is just the total hours that we have spent on the language. The total number of hours that you need to dedicate to achieve fluency is going to depend on several factors. Most importantly, what the languages that you already know are and how distant the language that you're learning is from those languages that you know. If you look up a figure on the internet for how much time it should take an English speaker to learn Spanish, one of the most frequently quoted figures is that of the American Foreign Service Institute, who claim that people can learn Spanish in 600 to 700 something hours. Now, a major problem with this estimate is that I don't think that people understand what this number is actually referring to. Is this total hours of study? Does this only include study in the classroom? Let's try to consider other estimates. If you go to the website of Instituto Cervantes, which is the major center that promotes the study of Spanish around the world, Instituto Cervantes does amazing work teaching the language. If you're looking for structured courses in the language, you should definitely go check them out. Depending on if you go to their UK website or US website, you're going to notice that to be prepared to take a B2 exam, you're going to need 420 or 450 classroom hours. However, these numbers don't really give us a good idea of hours you're supposed to spend on the language outside the classroom. So let's look at a different example. Let's look at MIT's Spanish language curriculum. Now, I feel rather confident in assessing that by the end of fourth semester Spanish, pretty much all of my classmates were fluent in the spoken language. When I started taking fifth semester Spanish, all of my classmates coming into the class were already at a basic level of fluency. So if we say that it takes 4 classes at MIT to reach B2 level in Spanish, each MIT class is supposed to consist of 50 hours in class over the semester and 100 hours of preparation outside of the classroom. One Spanish class is 150 hours. 4 Spanish classes are 600 hours. Let's say that maybe MIT classes are a bit higher on the intensity side. So I think 600 something hours is a good estimate for how long it will take you to reach fluency in the language starting from scratch. Let's see how intense your studying should be if you want to learn the language in a particular time period. If you only have 3 months to learn Spanish, that will come out as about 50 hours per week dedicated to the language. If you want to do it in 6 months, that will be about 25 hours per week. If you want to do it in a year, that will be 12 hours per week. If you want to do it over a 2-year time span, that will be about 6 hours a week that you need to dedicate to studying. Now, if you ask me which is better, which one you should go for if you have the luxury, I would advise you to spread out your study over a longer time period. That has to do with the science of how your brain learns, because transferring information from short-term memory into long-term memory also takes some time and resources. And if you cram too much studying into a short amount of time, you run the risk of leaving some information just in your short-term memory without really taking it deep in. How many total hours of study did it take me before my language placement interview? Well, unfortunately, I was not recording any of that. I did not intend to go on and reevaluate it later, so I am just basing my answer off of what I remember. I think, on average, I was spending maybe around 45 hours a week to get to my level, which would be around maybe 540, 550 hours in total. Yes, if you want to learn a language really quickly, it has to become your full-time job, and there is no going around that fact. Maybe you clicked on this video looking for a magic bullet that could massively reduce the time that it takes you to learn a language. But I will say that even if some magic solution does exist on the internet that can cut the time in half, I think it's a red herring to go looking for it. Why? If you're taking shortcuts in your study, you will not be training yourself on the skills that are really important in language learning, also skills that can transfer to other areas of your life. I want all of the numbers that I mentioned earlier to just be guidelines. Just remember that everyone's mileage varies, and it's not really that important how long it takes you, as long as you do the work and as long as you progress. The 4 most important components are consistency, dedication, motivation and attitude, and then last is the pace at which you progress. I think consistency and hard work are kind of self-explanatory, but what about motivation and attitude? What are the right kinds of attitudes and motivation that we should hold in order to do as best as we can in our language learning? I think the best way to sabotage our language learning journey is to let expectations take hold of us. Expectations in language learning are really the worst. It's so easy to set expectations that we're inevitably not going to achieve. And what happens when we don't meet our own expectations? We get discouraged and we quit. And so the best way to ensure that we're consistent and we don't quit is to get rid of expectations. I know this can be a very difficult thing to do. It's not going to happen overnight. Take it easy at first. Just notice the expectations about your learning process that you have at first, and then with time, that can get sorted on its own. Or if you like to think of it this way, you will be better equipped once you take the first step. What is my strategy when it comes to dealing with expectations? What I love doing is just setting goals that are so ambitious, so unrealistic that I know I can never expect to accomplish. Realistically, there are only two things that might happen. First is that I could miraculously achieve my impossible goal, and then that's the biggest reason to celebrate. But what is far more likely is that I am going to inevitably fall short of the goal that I set for myself. That is still a reason to celebrate, and that is still a reason to be proud, because ultimately, I know that I did my best. I gave it my best shot. Goals are not something that matter. What matters is what you do along the journey to get there. If I can give you an analogy to illustrate why expectations are a problem, imagine you're going on a hike and you have certain expectation of how long it will take you to reach your destination. At some point along the way, you're going to start asking yourself, or you're going to start asking your mates, how long do we have left? How long do we have left? How long do we have left? And once you get into that pattern, you're going to dread the rest of your journey. While on the other hand, if you only focus on taking one step at a time, taking one step at a time, you're going to get to your destination and you're not even going to notice. No, but really, try to stay curious and try to stay playful. Commit to doing the required steps every day so that future you has a slightly smaller workload to do. The next discussion point that I need to go over in order to be transparent with you guys is my linguistic background. As some of you may have noticed already, English is not my native language. I have an accent. I make countless grammatical mistakes, and that's okay. I still have a C2 certificate in English, and just listen to me how many mistakes I make. Now, to be fair, mistakes are perfectly normal. Native English speakers constantly make mistakes. I constantly make mistakes in Bulgarian, my native language. I studied English for 11 years in school and in private lessons. Then I lived in an English-speaking country for several years. I've also dabbled in quite a lot of other languages before. I studied Russian for 11 years in school. I studied French for 4 years, taking private lessons. And I also studied some German, tried to teach myself some Czech, some Korean, but with the last three, I really cannot claim any decent proficiency. But, undoubtedly, all of this has really helped me along the way. I was also deeply involved with Bulgaria's high school linguistics scene. I participated in a lot of linguistics competitions, locally and internationally. To this day, I still work with the Bulgarian Linguistics Olympiad Committee to continue the work so that I can hopefully give other students similar opportunities to what I have. When you're learning a foreign language, any amount of work learning other languages or doing linguistics will most certainly give you a head start. However, I really wouldn't say that all this additional background or any particular talents that I might have really somehow set me apart. If anything, in my Chinese classes at MIT, I was probably in the bottom 25% in terms of fluency by the time we got to Chinese 6. I had classmates who were American, who were learning a language for the first time, who learned to speak the language a lot more fluently than me, and they did not have all of this background. The most beneficial part out of all of these experiences, I would say, is that by the time I started to learn Spanish, I already had a really well-developed idea in my head of what methodologies work for me, what is a good fit for my personality, what are the strategies that I could see myself engage in most consistently. What are the strategies that, to me, felt the most effortless? Thank you for sticking with me so far. I know I've kept you waiting for a long time, but now with all of this out of the way, it's finally time for me to share the strategies that I use to learn Spanish so quickly and so effortlessly. For you to get the most out of this video, I am going to focus on techniques that I haven't seen other content creators talk about in detail or really stress how important they are. Again, another disclaimer, this is simply what I have discovered works best for me. Let's talk about how I would approach tackling the phonology of the language, meaning the sound system that comprises the language. This is one of the areas where my linguistics background helps a lot. I can just open the Wikipedia article for Spanish phonology or any other language and just take a look at all of the sounds written in the International Phonetic Alphabet, and I already have an idea of what sounds I should be careful about. If you don't know what the International Phonetic Alphabet is, I highly suggest you take a look at it. It's fun and it's really useful. When we learn English in schools in Bulgaria, the very first thing that we learn is the International Phonetic Alphabet. But if you don't want to do all of this extra work, that's okay. A lot of courses and textbooks have explanations about how the sounds of the language that you're learning match the sounds of your native language or the language that you already speak. And for sounds that don't exist in any language that you know already, I would suggest, even if you're not able to make those sounds in the beginning, just listen to a lot of YouTube videos on how to make those sounds. In Spanish, the most common ones that you need to care about are y, yo, yo, and the two R's, r and r, r, r. And I think this is really crucial to get out of the way really early in your language learning journey, because when in your head the sounds of your native language and the sounds of the language you're learning, if you don't separate them, your native language will start to interfere with your learning process. And also, it will be a little harder for native speakers of the language you're learning to understand you when you speak. So yeah, get a good grasp of the sounds in the language very early on. For a lot of people, understandably so, learning vocabulary is the most dreaded and detested part of the process. I used to be one of those people too, before I really clearly synthesized the methodology that I'm using. I would even go as far as to argue that vocabulary is the single most important component of the language that you are learning. If you only know vocabulary with no grammar, you will still be able to express yourself surprisingly well, and you will still understand a lot of what the other person wants to convey to you. A good way to accelerate how you learn vocabulary is taking advantage of something known as the Pareto principle, the 20-80 rule. Some in the language learning sphere might be familiar with one iteration of the 20-80 rule. I am not talking about this most common one. The Pareto principle is basically an observation that a lot of processes in nature and in human society obey the following rule. You have a very small percent of causes explaining the majority of results, and you have the majority of causes explaining a very small portion of the results. The 20-80 rule is a special case where 20% of the causes give rise to 80% of the results. The way that this is most commonly used in the language learning sphere is by using the observation that the 20% of the most common words in the language comprise 80% of the text of the language. The idea is that this 20% of vocabulary that is most common can give you 80% of understanding of the language. If you first learn this 20%, then you're giving yourself a huge head start in the beginning. This isn't as good of an idea as it sounds, because usually the most common words in the language don't carry that much meaning with them. A lot of the more niche words in the language are packed with all sorts of nuance that explain a very specialized or specific concept. What I am taking advantage of is a different understanding of the Pareto principle. If you've spent any time learning vocabulary in any language, you surely have noticed that some words just stick in your brain immediately. You need to read them once and they're memorized. Done. Other words, you need to review 20 times, then 20 more times, then 20 more times, and you still cannot get a handle of this. A lot of times, this process, whether a word is difficult or not, is purely random. However, statistically, on average, when you have a specific word list, some words are going to be very easy, some words are going to be very difficult. I think maybe the relationship is closer to 40% of the effort can let you learn 60% of those words in that list. 60% of your effort will be spent learning those other 40%. Now, let's consider that we have two of these word lists. Each one takes 100% of effort. Both of them combined will take 200% of the effort. If we spend some time in the very beginning figuring out which words are easier for us to learn, and believe me, after a while, you're going to get an intuition for which words are going to be easy and which ones not so easy. Taking the first list, spending 40% of effort to learn 60% of the words. Taking the second list, spending 40% of effort, learning 60% of the words. In total, we're going to have 80% of effort spent learning 120% of words in one word list. And when it comes to these more difficult words, we don't give up on them. When we identify that they're more difficult, we just add additional strategies to try to remember them. The consequence of all of this is that we can progress more quickly in a language when we try to learn more words at a time, and we don't worry so much about learning those words perfectly. So, learn more, learn it less effectively, don't aim for perfection. The reason why this strategy makes sense in the first place is thanks to the science of learning. It's a very common misconception that we learn like machines. We just take some factoid, shove it in a cell in our brain, and once it's there, we've learned it. We often assume that learning a word in a new language is like putting an equal sign between it and the closest equivalent in our native language. Learning is not as simple as that, and we can use that to our advantage. Language in the brain is more like a network. Information is not stored in individual biological cells in the brain, but rather in the connections between those cells. So the better we can use a word in our target language, the better connected it is to other concepts. The analogy that I have is that learning words is like building a staircase. You can sometimes build it in a day, but most of the time it takes repeated effort to progress one step at a time. And in these staircases that we're building, each step has different contribution. And the very first step that we build is realizing that the language has a special way to express this concept. This might seem very obvious at first, but it's actually a little more subtle. Yes, a lot of words have one-to-one correspondences between English and Spanish, but Spanish has some words that English doesn't express that neatly. For example, Spanish has words like abundar or escasear, which, even though can be translated in English to be abundant, to be scarce, in English these are not simple concepts, while in Spanish they are. So knowing that such a concept exists in the first place is the first step along the way. The next several steps along the staircase represent the sounds that make up a word. In a lot of European languages, even if you learn part of the pronunciation of a word incorrectly, most of the time you'll be able to understand it in speech. When you pronounce it, native speakers might understand you. Chinese is not like that. With Chinese, you have to get all of your words exactly right. That's just a consequence of the sound system of the language being more limiting. A lot more words sound more similar to each other. The next few steps along the stairwell have to do with the grammar of the expression. Is there anything interesting about how the phrase is composed? What rules of the grammar does it obey? Does it obey any exceptions? For example, to express the concept to realize in Spanish or in a Bulgarian, you don't just have a simple verb, but rather you have a whole idiom with interesting grammar attached to it. In Spanish, you say darse cuenta de algo. In Bulgarian, you say davam si smetka za. Both of these expressions literally mean give oneself a calculation. When you learn this concept, you learn that you have a verb that is reflexive, you learn that you have a noun, and you learn a preposition attached to it. The next few steps in our staircase represent the meaning of our words. The first step is just the most general meaning, and each step after that adds a level of nuance or specificity to the word that we're learning. And after that, we have a lot more steps that represent the context of how the word is used. It can also represent experiences that we've had with a word. They can also form connections to other concepts. Each time you review a word, even if you don't realize it, and even if you feel like you're not learning the word well, you are still making progress, building up the foundation of different steps along this staircase, even if you don't consciously realize it. And when it comes to words that, for whatever reason, we find more difficult to learn, we can focus on putting them in context, trying to build the staircase from the other direction. And naturally, through a lot of targeted repetition and trying out new strategies when something doesn't work, the brain will learn what it has to learn on its own. We don't have to force it. It can happen more naturally and more effortlessly. If you're only trying to learn words, cramming the night before an exam, you're not building a staircase. You're gonna have a lot of gaps that you wouldn't be able to fill up, and in time, this staircase will crumble. you will start forgetting the words. What I strongly recommend that you do if you're taking a language class, and something that I wish I had done more when I was taking Chinese in college, is in most textbooks, at the end of each unit, there's a review section that normally lists all of the new vocabulary that you're going to learn through this unit. What I suggest is, before the first class of your unit, just read through the review section and try to internalize the easiest of vocabulary from that section. When you go to class, you can now spend your efforts focusing on the words that you find more difficult. This isn't more work to do, this is just work that is better spread across time. And spreading your efforts over a longer time span is what is best for your long-term memory. This next tip is very commonly shared in the language learning sphere, but I think is worth reiterating. Use spaced repetition software like Anki. With it, you can just input all the vocabulary that you need to learn, and the software can do the work of figuring out when it's best to review. If you want to learn how to use Anki or any other spaced repetition software, there are plenty of other videos on YouTube. However, here are some additional tips that I feel like people should stress more often. First is that you should absolutely make your flashcard decks yourself. Now, it might be easy to just download what somebody else has done on the internet and start using that, but there is a lot of value making the vocabulary decks yourself in order to get that first exposure to what is it that you're actually learning. Remember that the first step to learning a word in your target language is recognizing that such concept exists. When you create your flashcard decks yourself, you are doing that work of getting to that first step, especially for more difficult words or with words that have confusing grammar associated with them. It's a great strategy to add example sentences to your flashcards and learn these words in those example sentences. You can also add mnemonics or anything else that is interesting about those words. If you're trying to learn a language that is related to whatever extent to languages that you already speak, this is true generally for languages that are part of the same family, like most European languages, or languages that are spoken in similar geographic locations. They tend to have similar influences. For more difficult words, it's definitely worth it to look into the etymology of the word, the history of the word. A lot of times, the way that words between languages are related is incredibly fascinating. Like my favorite example that I am going to provide here. Personally, I have figured out that I struggle a little bit more with words that signify direction or relative position. So in the beginning, it was really difficult for me to figure out that encima de in Spanish means on top of. And also that cima means the top part of something, or summit, mountaintop. But then when I dug into the etymology, I was really surprised to discover that the Spanish cima and the Bulgarian and Russian chuma actually have the same origin. The history of these words is incredibly fascinating, and I encourage you to do the research yourself and leave your conclusions in the comments. When I make you do the research on this on your own, you will be able to digest far better than if I just provided you with the answer. And even if you aren't learning Spanish or Russian or Bulgarian, I bet that after doing this research, you are going to remember these words for quite a long time. The strategy of learning in context that I used the most was making sure that my review sessions covered words that occupied the same semantic categories. For example, I would review words for direction and location in one session. In another session, I would review words related to healthcare and hygiene. This helps tremendously if you suddenly forget a word or an expression, because you have all of these connections to words in the same meaning category that it's very easy to rephrase so that you can still convey the same meaning that you want to express. This also helps you avoid the trap of feeling like you always need to translate from your native language to the language that you're learning. You are shifting the focus not on matching the concept to something in your native language, but to matching the concept to other concepts in the language. And thanks to Instituto Cervantes, Spanish actually has the perfect resource for this type of study that I feel like not that many people know about. In their online Biblioteca del Profesor, Instituto Cervantes has shared their entire curriculum plan open to any teacher or student of the Spanish language that tells you exactly what competencies you need to call yourself a speaker of the language at different levels on the Common European Framework. And most amazingly, it has vocabulary separated not only by levels, but also by semantic categories. So it makes it really simple to make flashcards, making sure that each deck comprises of all of the vocabulary that you need in a particular semantic category. You have categories that are more general and abstract, like notions of time, notions of existence, notions of locations, notions that describe mental states. And you also have categories that are more specific, like physical characteristics, family relationships, words that relate to education, words that relate to services, geography and nature, religion and philosophy. So what I did was, for each of these 27 categories, I assigned a specific Anki deck, and I included all of the words up to the B2 level and sprinkled in a lot of C1 level words so that I can review the whole basis of expressions for each category. And the way that I went about studying these 27 groups is, in July, I aimed to create one deck corresponding to a category each day. On average, each category having more than 200 words. you can understand why it is basically a full-time job to try to learn a language in just 3 months. I also tried to review 2 or 3, sometimes more, decks a day in their entirety, and often I would even review words that the software now considered that I knew really well. It is still a part of the exercise to associate the words that you know really well to those that you're still learning and you still have a lot to improve on. And with the mindset that I'm not aiming for perfection, I am not aiming to have 100% mastered every usage of all of these words, with the mindset that with each session, I want to be just a little better than my previous session. I want to just enjoy myself studying the language. This whole process starts to feel effortless. Effortless learning is what keeps you going for a long time. I'm gonna be leaving a link to this resource in the video description. Please, if anyone knows any similar resource in any language that separates vocabulary into semantic categories this neatly, please let me know. The HSK vocabulary lists are nowhere near this well organized as Instituto Cervantes' curriculum plan. I know this video and especially the last section were starting to get kind of long. I don't think I have too much to cover for the sections that are about to follow. My next major point of discussion is grammar and the way that I decided to approach Spanish grammar. At the very start of my journey with Spanish, I got a Spanish grammar book in order to get a brief but complete overview of what are all the grammar topics that I need to cover to reach around B2, C1 level in the language. Now, to give you an analogy of why I think that could be really useful is, again, keeping on with the hike analogies. If before you attempt a particular hike, you look at the map of the trail and take note of all of the important sites that you're going to see along the way, you will feel better prepared to go on this journey, and anytime you encounter those sites along the way, you would feel a burst of encouragement that, oh, you know where you are and you know where you're going. Yeah, again, having a background in linguistics helped me out quite a lot. I could just open the grammar manual, see that, oh, Spanish has a preterite tense, Spanish has an imperfect tense, and I already had a decent idea of what those were used to represent in the language. However, I don't think that having this background is necessary for you to benefit from this strategy. What you could do is just open the contents section of any grammar manual, skim through it, and try to come up with one sentence to describe each of the main grammar points. Of course, using the manual or the internet. For the preterite, you could say that, oh, this is a tense that is used to describe an action that was completed in the past. For the imperfect tense, you can describe that, oh, this tense is used when we have an incomplete action, an action that was interrupted for some reason in the past. And the next time you review grammar, after that, you can look into each of these concepts a little bit more deeply at your preference. You could look at conjugations or finer points like the verbs that change meaning depending on if you use them in the preterite or imperfect. Keeping this mindset that you're not trying to be perfect, you're just trying to be a little better than you who did the review last time. Now, you might ask, how does this compare in its effectiveness to the traditional, more linear approach of mastering one grammar point before moving to the next? I think it's really good to keep in mind that a lot of traditional pedagogy is designed to help your teachers help you. When you approach grammar and vocabulary in a more linear manner, it's easier for your instructors to identify your obstacles and weaker sides and then come up with strategies to personally help you overcome those challenges. Also, the strategy that I proposed works a lot better for synthetic languages. Those are languages where grammatical points are expressed by changing a word or adding stuff at the beginning and the end of the word. Those are most European languages. These types of languages are much easier to systematize in a manual and have a simple overview of all of the major grammar points. This isn't going to work so well if you're trying to study, for example, Chinese or the languages of Southeast Asia or the Pacific Ocean, because in those types of languages, a lot of grammar is expressed by using different constructions. You have to learn every construction for every type of context. I think the reason to tackle grammar the way that I did is primarily so that you can start enjoying native level content a lot earlier. You go through this strategy so you can make a lot more out of content that is well and beyond above your current level. In the beginner stages of my journey with Spanish, I followed the same method that I used to learn English back in the day. When I had my textbook, I just copied over pen and paper all of the dialogues and all of the texts. This might seem a little bit excessive to you. Yeah, once you get to the intermediate and advanced stages, this can become very tiresome, but I think this works really, really well for the earlier stages, because when you copy the entirety of a text, this process forces you to pay attention to every single part of the text. And then you're processing it this way, which helps build up your language intuition. While if you don't do this, you run the risk of your mind just glancing over different aspects of the texts. What we did for our Chinese classes at MIT is, I think, actually pretty similar. We used Cornelius Cobbler's textbook sequence, basic spoken Chinese and intermediate spoken Chinese. And for every class that we focused on the spoken language, we had these sketches that we had to memorize and roleplay as. We watched videotapes, listening to the language with the pinyin transcription of Chinese in front of us, and we basically had to reenact the scenes as best as we could. Again, the biggest benefit for doing this in the earlier stages of the language learning journey is that it keeps you accountable in processing all of the content that is in front of you. So you start to pick up an intuition for the language when you're still not fully sure how to form more complex sentences. Once I noticed that I was entering the intermediate stages of the language of Spanish, I went full in on trying to read and listen as much native content as I could, and I used this time in particular to familiarize myself with a lot of the dialects of Spanish that I wanted to be closer to, which in my case were the varieties of Latin American Spanish. Every day when I would take Nadia out for walks, the pup that you saw earlier, which would be about 1.5 hours every day, I would listen to episodes of NPR's podcast Radio Ambulante, which shares such fascinating stories of Latin America that are less known, that this was a great exposure to a lot of the varieties of Latin American Spanish, and I also got to learn a lot about the culture of the region. Now, regardless of how busy your days are, you can probably sneak in some listening time every day, even if it's just the 15 minutes in which you're in the bathroom, or the time that it takes you to drive to work. Getting started with listening is, I think, really simple because all of us have this time that we could instead dedicate to listening. If you're currently learning a language that is not English, why are you spending so much time listening to a guy in English? Please go seek out YouTube content in the language that you're learning. Get your feed with recommendations in the language. Make the steps of listening to the language easier for future you. And you know, it's perfectly okay and normal if you understand very little in the beginning and it takes you a lot of time to process what you're reading or listening to. Don't get discouraged, just bear the discomfort a little bit. It is going to get easier with each reading or listening session. Remember the Pareto principle that I discussed in the vocabulary section? When it comes to understanding the language, we see its application in reverse. At the very beginning, we have to spend the majority of our efforts to understand a minority of the content, but the more effort we put in, at some point, the gains that we get are going to become exponential, and we would have to dedicate only very little effort to understand a vast expanse of content. Let me demonstrate an example from my experience to show you what the application of this principle looks like in reality. I don't know who convinced me that this was a good idea to begin with, but I decided that by the end of the summer, I wanted to have read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Yes, that's a book that's very difficult to understand even when you're reading it in your native language. And me, who still wasn't even B1, decided to give this a go. In the beginning, this was excruciatingly difficult. It took me more than an hour just to get through the first page of the book in Spanish. But I didn't want to give up. I was persistent, and every page on the whole after the first one started taking just a little bit less time overall. And as my ability in the language improved, and as I got used to the style of writing of the author, the transition from taking me an hour to only taking me a few minutes to read a page was so sudden that I didn't even notice it. And after that, it was still challenging, but it was, compared to how I started out, a breeze. Don't know how well you're able to see this, but this is what my first page in the ebook version looked like with all of the highlighting. And these are the next few pages. And this is what pages further along start to look like. And you see that I am not highlighting as much anymore. But in order for you to succeed and not give up, you have to pick content that you are personally invested in, that can stimulate this internal motivation for you to keep going. I was not only excited to grab every opportunity that I could to learn about the region's culture and history. Also, as a neuroscience major, it was fascinating to see how a different culture describes and treats the neuropsychiatric ailments that befell Macondo in the book, like the insomnia plague or Rebecca's pica, her eating disorder. Because I had such a strong personal interest in the topics that were discussed in the book, it kept me going even though it was hard. And honestly, I will be pretty excited to make an entire video about the depictions of health and medicine in 100 Years of Solitude. It's awesome. And I know I saved this for last, but this is truly the single most important exercise that I'm sharing in this video. If you do this consistently, your fluency and your understanding will skyrocket. And I had to save this for last because this is really about how I bring together the methodology for studying vocabulary that I talked about, the methodology for studying grammar, and the methodology for getting input in the language. Anytime you encounter a word in a text that you're not entirely too sure what it means or why it's used this way, highlight it, look it up, analyze it, and after you do all of this, try to see if you can substitute it. When you encounter, for example, a verb that you don't feel fully comfortable with, be curious about it and try to ask questions in this line of thinking and then answer them to yourself. What does this verb mean here? Why did the author decide to use this verb instead of a different verb? What is this verb's conjugation? What is the subject? What is the tense? Why did the author use this subject and this tense? How would the meaning of the sentence change if you changed the subject or the tense of the verb? Is this a regular verb? Is this an irregular verb? Is there anything interesting about this verb that I need to know about? Is this verb used in the indicative or in the subjunctive? Why is it used in this particular mood? How would you have to change the structure of the sentence around to put this verb from indicative to subjunctive or from subjunctive to indicative? What does this verb have to agree with, and what else in the sentence agrees with this verb? The next line of questioning applies to all words in the language and not just verbs. What would be a synonym for this word? Does using that synonym instead change the nuance of the sentence? What happens when you switch the word to an antonym? Can you try to describe what this sentence says in your own words? Is this word a regional variant? What are some other words in the same semantic category that I can think of? Is this word a regional variant, or is it common across most dialects of the language? Is this word pronounced differently in any variant that I know? Keep asking yourself these questions. I know that in the beginning it's also going to feel uncomfortable, but the more you do this, the better you get at this and the easier it becomes. When you do this enough, you will naturally pick up on the most important words that are being used. If you don't pick up on something, then that probably means that it wasn't important enough. If it's something that's actually important, but you didn't clock it immediately as such, you're going to see it again, and again, and again, and again. And you're gonna notice that, oh, this appears so many times, it must be important. And let me show you an example of how I would do this exercise with the first phrase that I've highlighted in the first sentence. So I've highlighted pelotón de fusilamiento, and so the exercise will ask me to say this in my own words. So to express this, I would say something like: había un ejército, una milicia que mató, asesinó a esa persona políticamente. You know, there's 104 days of summer vacation, and if your annual problem is finding a good way to spend it, you're a student who is unemployed and looking for a hobby, maybe give my methodology a try and let me know how it works out in September. I am really curious what other people have to say about this, and I would love some validation to know that this has worked for other people and has gotten them to very high levels in a particular language of their choice. So remember, consistency hard work, good motivation and attitudes. The more internal your motivators, the better. And you can learn a language too. I know you can do it. I also wanted to give a special shout out and express my immense gratitude to all of the teachers and instructors who played a major role in helping me get to where I am today. This list includes Госпожа Жекова, Госпожа Mirkova, Miss Annie, Miss Toshkina, Miss Petkova, Madame Abrasheva, Frau Mineva, Gao 老师, Zhou 老师, Liang 老师, Liao 老师, Chen 老师, Professora San Martin e Professora Ewald. I also wanted to say thanks to my former high school, the High School of Math and Natural Sciences in Burgos, and an additional thank you to all of the people involved in high school linguistics in Bulgaria and on the international level. That's all from me for today, and expect to hear from me again soon. See y'all! There's a hornet that keeps banging its head into my window.